welcome to Healthcare Triage Live. We're almost perfectly on time this week. While we wait for everyone else to arrive, and I assume the theme music has ended, our usual run through the list. Check out hctmerch.com. Buy a mug, buy a poster. That'd be awesome. Or don't. It's your choice. Facebook.com/healthcaretriage. Lots of good stuff. You can see all our movies there. Our movies. We're a movie studio now. Our videos. And everything else we do. The Reddit site, reddit.r/hctriage. And of course, patreon.com/healthcaretriage, where we're constantly blown away that your continued support. People, even as little as $1 a month. Anything you can do, we appreciate. And if you don't, we still love you. We'll still be making these videos. We've been filming a lot, and we keep moving stuff around because, even though we've got some videos backlogged, stuff keeps getting newsy, like the Zika one. And in fact, this week's Healthcare Triage is also somewhat timely, so we have to move the schedule around. And now I'm babbling, so let's begin. Kieran George, are the health benefits of fatty foods like nuts, fish, and olive oil relative to other fatty foods or good replacements for any equivalent calories? So, I assume you're just asking me, are those fatty foods better than other fatty foods? Well, some fatty foods are bad. And there's the whole saturated fat, unsaturated fat, which is partially what's this getting at. But what you're describing with nuts, fish, and olive oil are the major components of what's known as the Mediterranean diet, which is, big in sort of vegetables, big in fish, and then big in olive oil, nuts, and, those are the sources sort of fat. Even they throw in wine in there. And there have been good randomized controlled trials of that diet, basically doing these things. Now, I would caution, as I always do, that you got to look at the details of those trials because they gave out tons of nuts and olive oil, and it looks like that the nuts are a huge component of it. But the end line results of the randomized controlled trials of the Mediterranean diet was that it actually reduced, cardiovascular bad outcomes. And it did reduce mortality. And, the number needed to treat is decent. So you'd have to stick to the diet for years. And many people that go on the diet won't see a benefit, but some will. And given that so much of our nutrition is not evidence-based, that one pretty much is. Now, do we understand completely why the science works and everything else? And then could I nail it? It's like that. Well, then you should only have this kind of fat. No, it's just not that clean. But if somebody tells me that they want to switch to a Mediterranean diet because they've heard studies that show that it's good in preventing cardiovascular bad outcomes, yeah, there is some. So that's fine. However, the number of people that can actually stick to diets that they don't necessarily like for the long term is small. So there are some benefits to answer your question. Terrytown. In observance of Ash Wednesday, many Catholics fast. What can one expect from a 24-hour fasting period? What about longer? Well, you can expect that you'll be hungry and thirsty. And that you probably, there you go. If you're asking me for long-term health consequences, probably not many. You can fast for 24 hours. Catholics do it every year for Ash Wednesday. Jewish people do it every year for Yom Kippur. People get headaches. They get, what was that? Ramadan, of course, yes. Although, is Ramadan a pure, 100% fast for 24 hours?
It's
See, I think, there you go. So it's not quite the same. This is asking for 24 hours. Regardless, fasting for an extended period of time will have, short-term consequences. Your body will let you know that it wants to eat and drink. But for 24 hours, you should be fine. It really won't have any long-term lasting effects. And there are people that promote this actually as a way to, control weight and do everything else. And I'm not sure I buy the evidence on that. Now, of course, going longer can have much more serious health consequences. So there's sort of this rule of thumb, if I remember it correctly, you can live 3 seconds without blood, 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food. And so if you go, if you approach more than 24 hours and going longer without drinking anything at all, you're going to have problems. Your body will not be happy, and dehydration becomes a major issue. Food-wise, we can go a decently long period of time without food. There are unfortunately many people in the world who starve and who go without food for significant periods of time for a long time. And so the long-term consequences there will be less dramatic, but will still be there. But, again, since this question was asking about a day, for most people, it's not a real big problem. Still might make you uncomfortable. The purple man-eater. I know that acetaminophen is bad for your liver, but I've heard lately from a coworker that ibuprofen is worse. What does the research say? So there's no question that acetaminophen is much worse for the liver than ibuprofen is. Ibuprofen's problems come mostly into the GI tract, less so in the liver. Both have bad effects when you use too much. Acetaminophen is horrific in overdose because unless treated pretty fast, it will cause permanent liver damage. And the amount of acetaminophen you need to take to start causing liver damage isn't as high as you might think. You take a bottle of Tylenol, you're going to have it. It's a bad thing. Ibuprofen, on the other hand, even if you quote unquote take too much, it's unlikely to cause that much long-term nasty damage. I mean, it has long-term link to GI bleeding and to ulcers and things like that, but that's usually for chronic overuse, much less so than a real big bolus of it. So for pure overdose purposes, which is worse? Probably acetaminophen. For which is worse for long-term irreversible effects, if you don't really nail quickly, acetaminophen. Having said that, they both do have bad side effects. And there's a lot of research coming out now that keeps in an associative manner through cohort studies linking the use of ibuprofen to bad outcomes in other areas like asthma or breathing during developing breathing difficulties. And again, that's long-term chronic use, not really necessarily like overdose. Both have consequences. All drugs have, benefits and harms, and you need to weigh them. Properly used, both appear to be very safe. But, you should always talk about that kind of stuff with your doctor. That's your best bet. Jill Gran, should we get tested for homocysteine and C-reactive protein for markers of inflammation and heart disease? Well, it depends who we is, Jill. If you're high risk, there are some protocols out there, and if you have certain diseases, then those can be useful markers and monitors for how well you're doing. If you have a long-term chronic inflammatory disorder, monitoring your C-reactive protein may be a way to sort of monitor how much of inflammation there is and how much problems you may be having. If you're saying, should we walk off the street and get everybody a homocysteine and CRP for heart disease? No. There's really no good, I think, evidence for that at all. That said, there are guidelines that say if you are very high risk, then these may be of value and this and that. But again, the devil's always in the details. So if your doctor's recommending that you get homocysteine and CRP, I would push back and say, why? And sort of what's the evidence? Why are you considering this for me? If they tell you because you're at monstrous risk for heart disease or because you have this long-term chronic illness, that may be a good reason why. If they go, meh, I don't know, we should just get it, then I would push back. But again, as I'm going to have to say after everything these questions, you should have that conversation with your healthcare professional because they may have a good reason that I don't know about for why they think that test would be a good idea for you. All right. M. Clisario says, as a medic, I frequently hear that medical treatment in the service, meaning the VA, is abysmal, especially when it comes to treatment of chronic pain. Are there studies on this? Also, what's wrong with the VA? Why does it take so long for them to respond to a claim, and how effective is the treatment they provide? So, let's start with the usual caveat of, the VA gets a bad rap often because it's public, and because it is government sort of run, owned, maintained, everything else. It's easier to get data and information about the VA than it is often about what goes on in private. So when something bad happens in the VA, we all sometimes hear about it. When something bad happens with your local private insurance or hospital, you might never know. Overall quality studies of the VA show that it's pretty good, that it does a pretty good job with many things. And it used to get a much worse rap than it has in more recent years because real strong QA efforts and a lot of oversight changes have resulted in great improvement in the VA. However, that of course fluctuates with funding and with sort of how oversight's going on. So when the VA is underfunded, they can't raise taxes themselves. They can't charge more. They can't do anything. And so they have no internal way to sort of get more money. So often what suffers is the back end in providing services, which is how you get to huge wait times and to some of the scandals we've heard of where people are on big wait lists and they fudge the numbers. So why does it take sometimes so long for them to respond to claim? Why are things sometimes bad? Because they're underfunded, or because they, perhaps lack certain incentives, and the oversight isn't as good as it should be, and they can't respond in the usual way that markets would, or the usual way that more private institutions would, by reducing, who can get in, and also changing the prices that they charge. And so that's part of it. And some part of it is also just, some people would say because it's a government organization and it's a bureaucracy and because the incentives are different than they are in private industry. They can't be fired. They can't be, penalized in the same way. Things happen more slowly. Why do they take so long to respond to a claim? Well, again, I'd caution you that everyone takes a long time to respond to a claim. I would want to know what the difference is in billing practices versus in the VA versus other institutions to know that. Their claims are very different as well because, again, they're not billing private insurance. They're a VA system. And so things are different. How effective is the treatment they provide? Again, that's so broad. Their drugs work just as well. Their operations work just as well. I know doctors who practice in the VA system who are phenomenal physicians. But that doesn't mean that the system sometimes doesn't break down or that there can't be issues. But I would caution you again on relying on the anecdote or the stories you've heard in determining how the whole system works. There are good studies about this, and a lot of them probably would confound your expectations. Question 6, Naproxen or Ibuprofen, which I use for what? That's not English, but we'll say which should you use for what? Thou buy that. That was indeterminate. So, boy, you guys are asking a lot of questions about these pain relievers. So Naproxen and Ibuprofen, both are going to have different side effects in the long term in terms of GI side effects or bleeding or neither one of them is a liver problem. They're both different in that, and they're both good in that they're both going to handle inflammation as well as pain and as well as fever. I believe at the end of the day that if you do sort of the meta-analyses or the randomized controlled trials for fever and for pain, ibuprofen works best. The difference is subtle. It's like Naproxen, if 40% of people might get relief, I think, if they take it for their pain, 50% might get it for your ibuprofen. They're both decent. They're both good. One might be slightly better than the other. People argue, depending upon which of those forms, you have to take less pills a day or more pills a day. Maybe that matters to you. You should talk to your doctor about which is best for you. If you're talking about over-the-counter use, they're probably, for the most part, pretty equivalent. A follow-up question is, both are readily available over-the-counter NSAIDs in North America. The ibuprofen is definitely more popular. Why would I want to choose one of it? Well, again, some of that is marketing. Some of that is the fact that ibuprofen does the best often in the studies of pain, both chronic and acute pain, of fever. It just performs a little bit better. I don't know why Naproxen isn't as popular. I just don't have a good answer for that. But if you personally, we have the big bottle, the Costco Monster Barrel-O ibuprofen in our house, and that's what we use most of the time. That's why I think it's partially because that tiny little difference that I know from my training, from looking at the research, it's slightly better. I think that the risk profile is pretty low. I'm not yet convinced by a lot of the big associative cohort studies that it is truly causal in some of the things that it's been found with some of the side effects or some of the long-term associations with other chronic illnesses. And so that is what I do. You, however, as always, should speak to your physician in determining what is best for you. Question 7 from Christina Lai 1. What is your opinion on the CDC's new recommendation that all women not on birth control abstain from alcohol? This is actually Monday's topic of healthcare triage. See, you're just ahead of the game. We just filmed it. You can see me. No, I think I was wearing that shirt. Anyway, it's going to probably be Monday's episode if we get all the graphics and everything done. And I'm looking over right there at Mark to see whether they're going to get done. So first of all, I wrote about this in my blog. You could go read it there. Monday's healthcare triage will be on this. You could go view that entire episode, but I'll give you the 2-second soundbite. I think that their message, if properly phrased, was decent. The idea that, alcohol is probably bad for women who are pregnant is true. That we don't know when it's safe. We don't know how much of it is safe. So that women who are pregnant, a lot of the recommendations say they shouldn't drink at all. True. Women who are having sex and not on birth control should have a higher risk of getting pregnant. True. Even women who have sex on birth control have a risk of getting pregnant. True. And women sometimes don't know that they are pregnant. True. So therefore, if you take all those truths together, women should be cognizant of the fact that if they're having sex and they're not on birth control and they are drinking, there's an elevated chance that they might actually be drinking while they are pregnant, and that could put a fetus at risk in utero for having a higher chance later of having fetal alcohol syndrome. True. But all of that is a nuanced discussion of risks and benefits that, absolutely got lost in what the CDC put out. Where first of all, they basically were like, if you could ever have a baby, never ever drink. Now, that of course classifies women sort of only as baby-making machines and refuses to acknowledge that they might have any kind of life for use outside of the baby-making process, that everything should only be focused on whether or not they're having a baby and the risk of the baby. And a lot of people very correctly lost their minds. I said a much stronger word in the episode. You should go watch it. Lost their minds appropriately when this was put out. They also started, put up a lot of things that like, drinking too much, increases, is going to give you basically like a sexually transmitted infection, or is going to lead to pregnancy. And of course, a lot of those things are associated with alcohol drinking, but that has nothing to, the alcohol does not cause that. It's, tied up in the alcohol and decision making and everything else. And it also, they're not putting out statements about men saying that, oh yeah, by the way, if you drink, you're more likely to result in a pregnancy, you're more likely to result in a sexually transmitted. It's only the women. And again, people lost their minds over that, and appropriately so. I think this was a communication messaging problem. I understand the CDC's intent. I understand where they're coming from. I wish they could have a more nuanced discussion sometimes. This goes for other advocacy groups as well, and is even the topic of healthcare triage news this week as well, because I think a lot of advocacy groups often fail to address nuance in terms of risks and benefits, and I think the CDC could have done a much better job. Having said that, I think the media went whole hog in focusing on the CDC's bad messaging as opposed to trying to reinterpret and say what the CDC should have said and what would be a good message for people and for women and for men who might have children and do drink. And I wish that we focused more on that and less on the gotcha news story of the day, which is let's screw the CDC because they really sort of, dropped the ball in terms of messaging the correct way. Watch Monday's episode for the full idea. Katie Cheliak says, hi there, would you be able to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of using intent to treat versus per protocol analysis in health research? Is one better than the other? That is a very sophisticated question. I will try and answer it quickly so that people will understand. When I do a randomized controlled trial, let's say I'm doing a diet study, for instance, or a drug, it could be a drug study, and I say this group over here is going to get the diet and this group over here is not. There are two ways that I could do the analysis, because some people in the diet group are not going to stick to the diet. We know that they're not. Like, there's just no way. Even when I do a drug study, some people might not take the drug. So the question is, should the people that don't follow the diet be analyzed as part of this group, the diet group, or should I put them into the no diet group because they didn't follow the diet? Some people would say, well, that's what you should do because that way we're really testing whether the diet or the drug works because we're only going to look at the people who actually did what they were supposed to do. And then we should take all the people who didn't listen and put them over here. That's a per protocol analysis. In other words, we analyze the people who followed the rules or followed the protocol and the people who didn't follow the protocol. And then we can get perhaps a more accurate representation about whether the intervention actually works. But there's a problem with that. It may be that the people who didn't follow it did so because of side effects or because of some other problem, and we won't be able to tell in the real world whether this thing works because those problems will also exist in the real world. Maybe then if we say, I give you this drug, well, some people are going to have a side effect and not be able to tolerate it, and we should know that. Maybe I give people a diet and it's so hard to follow, no one will actually follow it, and that won't fail in the real world. So when you do the per protocol analysis, what you're really testing sometimes is what we call efficacy. Like, does it work in the lab if they really do it? But it doesn't test effectiveness about like what'll happen in the real world. To do that, we have to do an intent to treat analysis. Instead, where I'm not measuring whether or not they took the pill or whether or not they felt the diet. I'm just checking, followed the diet. I'm testing whether our intent to get them to made a difference. So everyone I told to follow the diet is analyzed together. Everyone I told not to is analyzed together. Everyone I told to take the pill is analyzed together. Everyone I told not to take the pill is analyzed together. And even if they didn't take the pill, even if they didn't follow the diet, they're analyzed over there. That's effectiveness, because that's a good measure of what will the prescription that I write do? What will telling people to follow the diet do? And that's the real world. That's an intent to treat analysis. And sometimes it biases you to find a null result because you know some of the people over here are not going to do what we told them to do. But if we see a difference, even with just the telling people what to do, then we can be pretty, assured that in the real world, when the same intervention is just telling people what to do, they'll follow it. It's not as much efficacy, but it is more effectiveness. It tells us about the real world actions of the interventions we make. Most big, good, high quality studies are intent to treat analyses because that's the real world. Because again, I can't tell which patients are going to do the prescription I do. I can't tell which patients will follow the diet. But I can know from an intent to treat analysis that if I write the prescription, if I assign the diet, I can know what kind of benefit or not I'm going to see. And that's why probably more people would choose an intent to treat analysis. Hope I answered that. I can't even read the next person because it's the thing's all in Russian. But they said, what does the research say about various drugs used to treat anxiety disorders? Is there any evidence that antidepressants are effective at treating anxiety? Yes, but a lot of those studies that are originally done focus on very specific populations with lots of exclusions and inclusions. And so the problem is that there's some evidence that antidepressants and other drugs work to treat anxiety disorders if you fall into very specific populations. The problem is we have since expanded our use of those drugs into people who do not fall into those groups, who have less of a problem or have other issues, and then we're just not as sure. Now, if you're asking me about short-term things like Xanax, for that'll work, but it's not good for long term. I mean, it does sort of treat anxiety, but it's not good for sort of chronic problems. Especially when you're talking about the antidepressants, we're trying to use more long-term medications. I think, unfortunately, more and more research is showing us that those drugs don't work as well as we think they do in the general population. Again, this could be an efficacy effectiveness thing. It's they work for certain people when they take them, but that doesn't mean they work in the real world for everyone. And so I would really tell you that you should be talking to your doctor. If you're concerned about anxiety and which mental health drugs you should be taking, you absolutely should be speaking to your physician about what would be best for you. Because, there are other things you can try too in terms of therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy and other things as well to treat anxiety. Ikuan11 asks, what would be the ramifications of the common Republican proposal to allow buying or selling of insurance across state lines? Somebody asked me this on Twitter yesterday, and I retweeted a piece I'd written in 2011 on this. And then Margot Sanger-Katz, who's one of my colleagues at the Upshot at the New York Times, tweeted in a much more recent piece and thorough piece. She wrote, I think it was just in June or July on this. The big thing is that it's not the buying or selling of insurance across state lines. The problem is that we have regulations, and that states up until now. States, actually, and still actually for the most part, states set their own regulations about what insurance has to do, which is why insurance companies had to create 50 different products because each state was setting the insurance about what they did. The problem with selling across state lines, which sounds great in theory, is that what people are actually asking for is to get rid of the regulations. In other words, be able to buy any product or sell it anywhere you like anywhere. Or, that if you can sell across state lines, then what would happen is, of course, all the insurance companies would move to the state with the least amount of regulations, which is what happened with the credit card industry when all the companies moved to Delaware, which basically had the least amount of regulations. So let's say Texas, for instance. All the insurance companies moved to Texas and then could start selling their Texas products everywhere. They don't meet the regulations of a California, New York, probably even in Indiana. But now you'll be able to do it. Now, with no regulations, you can get cheap policies if you're healthy and you're young and you have no chronic problems, because that's what insurance companies would do. They would sell all their products to the people who cost least. And of course, those products would be cheap, which would mean that a lot of people would be able to buy cheaper policies because they are healthy. But sick people would be totally out of luck, because who would sell them a policy? If the companies don't have to sell to you, if there's no guaranteed issue, if there's no community rating, then basically they could just means test you on whether you have a problem or have an illness, and then just refuse to sell you a policy or sell you something in an astronomical amount. This is why there is no problem. The Affordable Care Act has federal exchanges. I mean, it is possible that we could say tomorrow there's a basement about what insurance would be, and then we could sell it across state lines. But the Republican proposals, for the most part, don't do that. They don't set a base regulation and then say now you can sell it across state lines. What they do is they say let the states do it. Let's eliminate federal control of any kind of monitoring of those regulations and just force states basically to be able to not be able to control their own wall-to-wall regulations. It'll all just default to whichever state has the least amount of regulations. That probably will not reduce overall healthcare spending. That will make it cheaper for healthy people to get insurance. And because most people are healthy, most Americans will be able to get a cheap policy. But everyone who has a chronic illness, everyone who's sick, everyone who might be pregnant, might give birth, all those other things, will be unable to get policies to cover those issues. So it's not a great solution for probably improving the quality or health of the United States healthcare system. I encourage you to go read Margot's piece. If you go to my Twitter feed, you will see that I tweeted it in the last 24 hours. You can go read my piece. You will also see I tweeted in the last 24 hours. So, another great reason to follow me on Twitter. You'd already have all this information. Luke Maurer, got an MRI for monocular diplopia. Apparently a pinhole could just as easily have told him that it wasn't neural, stroke, etc. Would another country's system have denied the MRI? Have I been pampered? I don't know about pampered. Yes, so here's the thing. Would another country's system that's trying to control costs possibly have required you to get the cheaper test before you get the more serious test? Yes. Would many insurance companies in the United States require that as well? Yes. Lots of HMOs and other, systems would require you to say, well, let's do the cheap test first before we do the expensive test. There's a good argument to be made that makes sense. Same way that we have formulas in the United States. Try the cheap drug first, then go to the expensive drug. The problem often with our healthcare system is that happens too rarely. And so we just, whatever you want to get happens. Ironically enough, it's easiest to do this sometimes with Medicare, our single payer system, where basically they almost have the hardest time saying no to all kinds of stuff because no politician wants to be associated with that. So I don't know if I'd call this pampered. I would call this overtreated. I would call this not cost effective. That is often what we do. And if you were asking me like what I would do, yeah, I would absolutely design a system where if the cheap test is just as good as the expensive test, I would just pay what the cheap test costs. This is the United States of America. If you want to pay out of pocket for the other test, feel free. But you shouldn't be spending my money in terms of either premiums or in terms of tax dollars to get that expensive test, which is really no better than the cheap test. So yes, do I think other systems are sometimes more rational? Do I think some systems in the United States are more rational than others? Yes. I think the ones that try to think about, spending money and using things in terms of the best cost effectiveness probably makes much more sense. Zach Heilman asks, is there any promising research on using units other than calories to measure caloric intake? Do any other unit systems lead to a reduction in calories consumed? I don't know what other units other than calories you would use to measure caloric intake.
Weight Watchers points.
But that's still not looking at caloric intake. That's still trying to look at like how much you're eating. So, and Weight Watchers points, if you get down to the math of it, because some people have like broken the code, it really is sort of like, collection of carbs, collection of fats, which basically are rough estimate of calories, and then they give you some money back in the back end for fiber. So here's the problem with calories. One is that there's a lot of research that says per calorie is not a calorie. The second is that it turns out the amount of calories you put into your mouth is not necessarily equal to the amount of calories your body absorbs. For instance, they found that for many nuts, you're pooping out still a fairly large amount of the calories. So maybe you're getting 2/3 of the calories that you're eating. Other stuff, you're getting all of it. Ironically enough, the more processed foods make it, I think, easier to do it. So there's a lot of evidence that the rarer you eat your meat, the fewer calories you're getting out of it because your body can't break it down as easily as it can well done or really cooked meat. So this is why I think if you look at my food recommendations, I'm really sort of anti-processing as much as you possibly can be, because I think that's part of, this is again Aaron theory. I think part of the problem is we've made it too easy to stuff ourselves full of food we don't need. And processing does that. But I don't know what other unit to use. Like calorie is what we've got. And so I don't even know what unit systems you're thinking of to talk about a reduction in calories consumed. If we are going to talk about the Weight Watchers system or the Jenny Craig system or the, all of the systems, regardless, almost all of those diets work in getting people to eat fewer calories. And that is often associated with reductions in weight. But all those diets sort of work roughly about the same. It's really what works for you. So I don't know what other metric to use. I can't think of another. But I do think we could be more sophisticated in talking about what we think the body will get out of what we're eating, as opposed to just saying this much of X is that many calories, regardless of how we prepare it, regardless of what it's mixed in, how much processing goes into it, or everything else. Because clearly saying that this nut and this piece of cake have the same amount of calories is not saying that your body's getting the same thing out of it, literally or, in terms of nutrition. Phonic UK asks, are there any health... Oh, I'd say I'm overdone. We're going last question here. Phonic UK 1, are there any health benefits or risks associated with eating a large number of small meals through the day, constant grazing, snacking, assuming nutritionally balanced foods, compared to normal meals? Tons of controversy over this, no clear answer. It's what works again for you. If you do well with lots of small meals throughout the day, awesome, I'd say go with that. If you don't do well with that and you like 3 big meals a day, awesome, go with that. If you like 1 huge meal a day and that works for you, awesome, go for that. The question people often ask is, should I force myself into another routine because I think it will be better? Not a lot of good evidence for that. I, as we've talked about before on the show, do not eat breakfast. This is my intake. I usually eat a small lunch, although today I might eat larger. And then dinner is really where I eat, and sometimes I have a snack. That's me. I don't tell anyone else to do that. My wife eats breakfast, she eats lunch, she eats dinner, and sometimes snacks as well. She's probably better weight management than I am. My kids even are varied. Jacob doesn't like to eat breakfast. Noah and Sydney, Sydney's making that omelet like every morning. Noah would eat every meal plus if I'd let him. So that's it. So, I don't think there's a good answer to tell you what to do. What else? I'm seeing other questions on there. Unfortunately, some of them are timely, but I can't get them today, so tune in next week. Anyway, thank you very much for tuning into Healthcare Triage Live. Watch Friday for some timely newsy stuff. Watch Monday for talking about timely newsy CDC recommendations and alcohol, if we get it done in time. Watch next week for Healthcare Triage Live. I'm going on vacation this weekend. I'll be skiing. I'm very excited, but I will be back in time for Healthcare Triage next Wednesday. So you won't miss a thing. Go check us out. Facebook.com/healthcaretriage, HCTmerch.com, buy your mugs and posters, Patreon.com/healthcaretriage, support us in any way you can. Even if you don't, we still want you to keep coming back and watching forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. Thank you so much. See you next week.